Hi guys, welcome to another Glasshouse episode. Today we are running with a skeleton crew of pure quality with myself, Silas, Tangi, and Jags when he gets out of bed. And yeah, that'll be it. So it has been a bit of a week. There's been some cool stuff. Mudge did a thing. I don't know if you guys have heard of this. So Mudge has blown the whistle on Twitter being essentially the same as every other company and not really paying a lot of attention to security. So that's big news. There was a huge DDoS against like Lockbit, is it? Like, yeah, it's the Lockbit ransomware. They hit Entrust, Entrust hit back, Lockbit dumped the docs. It's been amusing. There was the release of a receipt for surveillance software, which has made everyone very, very excited because it proves that iOS ODays sell for $8 million, or it proves that an iOS ODay plus 1 year support plus an Android ODay plus an entire surveillance package sells for $8 million, or it doesn't prove any of that. So that's been cool. We were talking about something else, which was super interesting. Oh yeah, the propaganda, U.S. propaganda disinformation network that had literally no traction at all. So that was a thing that happened this week as well. So cool. I'm gonna throw it open.
So I'm interested in the Lockbit stuff for a lot of obvious reasons. Um, as one point to make as well. So Lockbit gets hit by DDoS following Entrust. Not Lockbit though releases on Breached a copy of the data, or they released part one and part three. There's another user that released part two. Um, don't quite understand that shift up, but it seems like there's a little bit of conflict there, and not necessarily Lockbit that posted that data. But it was interesting too because when Lockbit pushed out the new version of their stuff, like they had a whole load balancer set up through Tor stuff to prevent this type of stuff. So, um, yeah, I'm quite curious to know
Money well
more.
spent, clearly. Like that, they're better at like taking money than they are at creating high uptime, like high uptime.
Hey, I'm not
Go.
here to judge. Like running
So
systems is tough.
ransomware SRE. That's what they're missing in their infrastructure, right? They need more SREs so that they can get like better uptime. But yeah, like I'm surprised that like an HTTP DDoS could run through Tor. Like just running that attack must be such a pain in the ass because you don't have a lot of bandwidth when you're doing like client side stuff. It's slow and crappy.
I
And
imagine I imagine it just becomes a thing of farming it out to as many systems as possible and pushing it through.
right. But they also only let you run 3 instances on a single IP. So you can't like spin up a load of containers and distribute it, that way. You have to like,
So you need
yeah,
you need more IP space. But assuming that you had
right.
several
Well,
hundred systems and then each was
clearly
pushing.
it can be done. Right. But yeah, so no, like you were saying, like there's some interesting stuff about how it was actually leaked. Like I wasn't aware of the details on that.
Yeah, and I need to go back and double check it. But like from my understanding is that whoever pushed it to breach was not the same as the one that posted it to, or is presumably pending posting to their data leak site. Um, but I thought it was interesting because people were discussing the possibly it's an affiliate that's upset, and we're seeing another issue. Uh, but I feel like people don't often comment on the possibility that it was literally just another actor that got like heard the word that Lockbit's going to be dumping everything, and they were like, well, fuck, we're already here. We need to get rid of this exfil we have, so might as well like try and stick it to another guy who kicked over our op. So
There, there you go. That's actually an interesting idea that the the overlap of cyber threat actors who hit the same target, and one of them is sort of like faster off the mark to get their ransomware installed. Like,
Or
how
or
often?
is louder and is
uh,
going to do something like if you're going lone zone, like your goal is to steal data or steal the root CA stuff, and somebody else comes in and starts encrypting stuff behind you, they're going to be rolling everything anyway. So the
right.
predictable lifespan then of that data and its use immediately starts to drop. So
Yeah. What does Entrust make that would be useful to subvert? Like, what access would anyone get from it? Because that would have been an interesting thing if someone was planning a much more exciting op that got like foiled by like these ransomware assholes.
well, funny enough, when Entrust announced that they were about the customer notice about a security issue was released, I was actually talking to a sales engineer there about buying some code sign or not code signing, uh, some SSL certs. So
Mm,
already a lot of value in a place like that.
yeah, that's actually very, very interesting. I mean, yeah, like the idea that this like other actor is just annoyed at the whole thing and like has completely lost any value that they were going to get, and so they're just like, well, fuck it, let's have some lols.
I
Like
mean,
that's the only joy left.
yeah, or try and try and make some use of the data while they have it before it gets burned. So
Yeah, fair enough. So, I want to talk about the propaganda network because I think that that is very amusing. Basically, like several things stick out to me as being worthy of note. One of which is that the majority of their posts had one interaction. So, like, they had like one like on average for everything that they did, which is a little bit below what the Russians were achieving. I mean, the Russians managed to throw an election and make Brexit happen, and the US managed to get, a few likes for millions and millions of dollars. So I find that like part of the like I find it amusing just because it's funny that they screwed it up, but I also find it amusing because obviously what must have happened it like this started in 2017. So clearly they put out a tender or someone made a proposal and said like, hey, the Russians have won. We must not allow there to be a disinformation bot gap. And so there was money thrown at this thing. They put together some like bot network. They ran it for all this time and they weren't good at it, which is, I think, effectively the same thing as having a disinformation bot gap. Like, it doesn't help if you have missiles that don't work. Like, you can't say like we have the same number of tubes that will like, spout flame out of one end. I mean, ours don't go anywhere, but it's pretty much the same thing as having the same number of missiles if you think
Hey,
about
some
it.
countries do just that. Okay, don't don't put that out there.
Yeah, but I find it interesting that in 5 years they couldn't make it work. I mean, I think part of it is that there was such a low effort action. Like, they were doing things like rewriting press releases from Pentagon and just putting them out, which is, you know, they are not written to be highly engaging and to like polarize people into saying something, right? No one reads a like like press releases from the Pentagon do not have like Al Qaeda hates him, like this one weird trick. Meet the drone operator that like
That's a cultural issue, right? And honestly, it's I'll put it on two levels. Like I think culturally, we're not in the best situation to think about active measures in the US and then bureaucratically, like I just don't see what part of the US government, leaving pockets of the IC aside, could effectively take that challenge on. I mean, there's so much about misrepresentation and having no control about the splash damage of what your,
so
manipulation psyop campaign
I
can
think it would
have,
have to
right?
be run out of, yeah, like I think you're right on that. It would have to be run out of state. Like state would be like I know Tanji probably
It would
This,
have to be run out of Britain.
it was a mortal enemy, but
yeah, this would have
there
to be, this would be a great conversation to have Matt Armstrong on whenever we can reschedule him. for this. But that they were terrible at it is compounded by the fact. So 2017, right? So one base year plus 4 option years, right? So for 5 years, whoever the COTAR is, or whoever the program manager is, was equally incompetent or unknowledgeable about this thing.
Well, hold on.
Perpetuate this fraud.
Let's give some possibility here. It looks like in this total scheme of their spend, they only spent $1.25 million, which at Russia's kind of like peak during right around the election stuff, I think there was like a 2-month period where they spent the same amount.
Yeah.
So
that's self-efficient money. Yeah.
That is like, if you went to the Pentagon and said like, over 5 years, I need $1 million, like they wouldn't know what to do with you because they don't have amounts of money that small.
It's
you know, like they can't process that. That's not like their Excel sheet doesn't go that far down, you know. So yeah, but I think you're right, man. Fraud is the best.
But let's look at it sort of a slightly different way, right? Like I think if you try to compare to what may be other PSYOP sort of operations at this point, like you look at something like Labduktagon or Green Leakers or Intrusion Truth, or I mean, which are all possible things that people talk about all the time, but have some effect, right? People talk about them, they influence the conversation, they get information out there that wouldn't otherwise be there, and sort of have this sort of amplifying effect. I'm not saying those are US. I actually have a hard time believing that they're US precisely because of the same limitations that we're talking about now, right? Like the idea that you could get information declassified, that somebody would look at the assessment of what effects that operation could have long term, and they would be like, yeah, totally, let's do this. Like that seems very hard to stomach.
And they would do that in less than 18 months.
Right.
You would come out and you'd be like, here's the plan, and they'll be like, great, we'll put it on the pile, it'll go through approval, you know, like
as soon as it past the lawyers and the bean counters and everything. No, but I do think that there's if you look at some of the public discussions about Cyber Command when they were talking about operations with ISIS, a lot of the discussion seems to go around things being localized in effect and not creating, you know, your like the government created AIDS type story that lasts for 70 years and continues to roll on. And I think having that kind of caution is antithetical to the whole idea of creating these sorts of campaigns, right? Like if you want to have control over how far the narrative's going to go, you can't talk about trying to make it viral and have the narrative take a life of its own.
Exactly. Like if you want something that's going to spread, you can't go like, we need something that will not spread, you know, that will have no longevity, that no one's going to want to tell anyone else.
Right.
But it also has to, you know, go everywhere.
This
like
much, but only this much, right? It's
like viral, but only to your closest friends, not to like all of your contacts, you know, just to the small internet group.
It's an entire disinformation campaign through Signal, one person at a time, just messages.
It's a game of telephone. Pass it along, bro.
So here's why I think there's a difference between this and like Intrusion Truth, for example. Like this was a bot campaign, like it was all made up of bots, and it was meant to be like automated interaction, and it didn't work. And that's because that, like, even for the Russians, that doesn't work, and it didn't really work. Like that wasn't an effective thing for them. So replicating like one of their least effective strategies or their least effective tactic, you know, it might be good for getting a paycheck, but it's not going to be good for actually replicating their capability. You know, like this didn't work for them, but they have one, and we need to have one as well. Otherwise, you know, we'll have like this ineffective IO gap. Like we need our own ineffective IO. And so I think that's the difference. Like Intrusion Truth is not a network of bots, you know, it's about putting out original information that has been analyzed and processed and put together in narrative form. And, you know, like it's a thing, it's product. It's not like
not to sort of make those but I guess in my mind, I'm thinking IRA style, you had a bit of both. Right, if you wanted to make sort of effective messaging, answering, and disrupt conversations the people at the IRA were actually, they weren't necessarily crafting narratives, but they were making proper responses and coming up with bullshit ideas and seeing what sticks. And I think that something like Intrusion Truth highlights our inabilities and our shortcomings in the United States, which is that I don't think we could stomach making that shit up, right?
Right.
On the bot side, obviously, that's not the problem. That's not the issue at all. If all you're doing is sort of your mass nonsense response and disruption, whatever, like anybody could code that up and it'll be equally ineffective in its way. But if you actually wanted effective engagement, if we're talking about a program manager who after a year goes, hey, we need to make this work better, you do need narratives, right? You need someone to actually write something that people will engage with.
I think this is an interesting point there, is that when you look at IRA, like one of the things they were doing was they were doing multiple times a day. They were looking at the metrics of different stories. They were looking at the direct engagement, and they were looking at like what looks like it's going to be the next big thing. And they were doing multiple taskings per day to make sure that they were constantly on top of it. Whereas it seems in this case that even on a yearly basis, they weren't looking at the metrics and saying, okay, we're doing a good job, right? Like the IRA was looking at what was going on, and they were making sure like every 12 hours or so that they readjusted to stay on top of things. So, you know, like their metrics weren't going down, the engagement was staying high, that, you know, stories that were losing interest were sort of dropped in favor of things that were coming up, so that their resources were properly allocated. Whereas clearly what was happening here is, you know, fraud. Like they were doing a shit job, nothing was happening, and whoever was supposed to be monitoring it was going like, yeah, it looks good to me. You know, you say you've had several thousand likes over the last year with, you know, several thousand posts. Brilliant. You know, like I think,
well, we're talking about bots. Should we transition to the story that everyone actually expects us to talk about? Like, just because, like, if you are going to talk about a bot army, the fact that these can exist and be ineffective but uncaught and not shut down might be a good transition to a topic du jour.
really, was there something about Twitter or bots?
People keep
thing?
mentioning Twitter. I don't know if maybe we've missed some kind of Twitter controversy or.
I haven't really been paying attention this week. Was there anything? Do you guys
Wait,
know?
did they catch that kid who hacked Twitter a few years ago? And when the U.S. declared that it was critical
maybe it was just
infrastructure, also.
Yeah, was it his sentencing? Is that a thing?
No way they're gonna catch that guy.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
So, yeah, the Mudge story, which I have to say, part of the mainstream coverage of it has been on his name being Mudge, which has really freaked people out. And like, even like his like career has been basically, you know, after Loft, it was all like super white collar government, you know, aligned, et cetera, et cetera. So he's not like, if it's a name that freaks you out with someone with that sort of fucking history, then yeah, I don't think InfoSec has got much hope of ever being accepted by
It
the
doesn't,
mainstream.
right? One of the things that pissed me off, and I ended up, you know, going on my little Twitter vendetta, was someone sent me a link to some idiot former CISO's LinkedIn post about how he would never hire someone like Mudge because they wouldn't have the skills to handle the board. And like, you know, these hackers are this, that, and the other. And first of all, I do want to point two things out. Mudge wasn't CISO. There was a CISO who apparently is beyond scrutiny in any of this, right? Like nobody needs to talk about this person. And B, like, it's starting to highlight a lot of the kind of insecurities and misconceptions that a lot of these folks who seem very comfortable with the board but don't seem to understand the crux of what Mudge seems to be putting out there right now have. Right? Like the issue here isn't like I'm a hacker and I wish you would take me seriously about security.
You can't fire me. I'm going to fire you. I'll write about like that's not what happened.
Yeah, it's very clear why he used so in the document to the SEC, he used and like references himself as Mudge, and part of that I think is because, and I'm definitely not my original idea on this, but it's I think to highlight that the reason that this information is being brought forward and why he's whistleblowing on this is part of the hacker spirit, and it's a callback to some of that to give a basis for it. Because whistleblowing has kind of gotten a pretty horrendous reputation since that asshole who moved to Russia.
Yeah.
So
So Jags, like Ed Amoroso, right? Spends his
no.
career at AT&T.
Sorry, keep going.
Spends his career at AT&T, right? So he's basically the definition of a company man. So of course that's going to be his take, right? And his ignorance, willful or not, of Mudge's career post Loft is neither here nor there. If that's your opinion and that's your angle on this, that's fine. But you should probably pay attention, do your homework, and understand that this guy is not just he's not just some crazy haired lunatic who is bringing these things up, and is it illegal to have shit security? No, it is absolutely not illegal to have shit security. It is absolutely illegal to lie to the SEC, right? That's the thing that people are missing. It's like, well, all these graybeards is like, oh, well, every organization has these sorts of issues. Yeah. Organizations that lie to the government, right? Martha Stewart didn't go to prison for insider trading. She went to prison for lying to the FBI, right?
Right. The difference between walking home with stationery from the office and walking home with TSSCI documents from the office.
You leave Mar-a-Lago out
it's
of
not
it.
the paper that's the problem.
And to the point about whistleblowing, whistleblowers stay and they take the slings and arrows, right? He has everything to lose. Right?
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing I'll say. Look, Mudge could do whatever the flying fuck he wants with his career at this point, and instead he's taking on this massive headache. I'll tell you, whatever it is, it's for a good reason. What pissed me off about the Adam Moroso thing is, beyond everything we could say about what has happened during his tenure at certain companies, there is a CISO. Why aren't we talking about Rinky Sethi and everybody else that was involved in that chain of command, and everybody else that was around Mudge but didn't seem to have a problem with what was going on, right? That's my real issue there. Let's not call into question whether Mudge has the right credentials to tell us that people are lying. Where is everyone else involved in all this?
Yeah, I thought that like some of the interesting stuff that came out of the reporting was along those lines, where they would talk to people who had worked as well, and it was like, well, Mudge doesn't necessarily know all of the details of like the SEC obligations that we have. It's like, does he know? Like, he probably boned up on them before writing a fucking whistleblower document and putting his name on it. Like, I'm guessing that's the sort of thing that like he's not half-assing. Like, out of all of the things that he wouldn't like pay attention to, that's not one of them. But also, like, a lot of the time when they spoke to people, they'd be like, yeah, it's kind of how it was, or like, he never got any FaceTime with any of the executives, and like he didn't fit in, which to me is an indictment of their culture, not of him. Like, it's if you can't find a way to use Mudge to make better security, like, you're absolutely fucked. Like, he's one of the nicest dudes you can meet in that term. Like, he's not going to be like my way or the highway. He's
not the radical hacker that you might have thought 30 years ago. I mean, the guy, if he could make DARPA work, if he could make all his other sort of jobs work it's not like he hasn't adapted and made it possible to discuss these other folks. What I do want to point out, and I think it's funny because I tweeted about it like a week before this happened. I had no idea that like this was coming at all. But like, Twitter is a shit show when it comes to security. Twitter is a complete shit show. When it has been a shit show for years, like abuse-wise, any kind of like reporting-wise. They don't do any threat intel sharing. You can't get them to answer anything or collaborate on anything. And that's long before Mudge and long after Mudge. Like, so we're not talking about a company that, had a great security culture and then one person didn't fit in.
Yeah, I mean, there's also basic things that they haven't done for years that everybody knows they should be doing, like the multiple account registration from a single host. Like, there's been the douchebag that's been trolling women in InfoSec. Like, there's at least 2 to 3 dedicated long-term fucking douchebags that are just rolling around out there. And despite people's attempts to get Twitter to come to the table to actually help, it sounds like it's been radio silence. And there's a lot of stuff like, and I brought up before when they got breached by somebody that I think popped the credentials for one of the employees. But the fact that like so many employees also have direct database access to look up private messages and user account details, but nobody still is coming forward to the table is also such a reflective problem.
But also they don't have auditing that alerts on that, because it seems to me that that's the sort of thing, like, it just, like,
Well-
these are the sorts of things that you would expect to be in place for something that's literally critical national infrastructure at this point. Like, global news runs on Twitter. Like, that's how the news works. Without Twitter, like, the New York Times wouldn't publish because there wouldn't be anything happening.
Dude, all I'm saying is in comparison, right? Go work at Facebook and go check your ex-girlfriend's messages and see how quickly they walk you out the front door, right? Like, and that's precisely the way that it should be, right? Like when I ask someone,
try Google and look at someone's Gmails, right?
right?
Like, show up and be like, let's go and read what someone's getting in their email. That's not going to happen.
Well,
right? Like,
that's why, like,
is
when you ask someone at Facebook to help you with an account thing, they're like, hey, I can't, like, go talk to these people who are going to help you. At Twitter, any of them could, but they just won't because they can't be bothered to. And like that's where you get into the, you know, forget that the tech support side of it, but it's like that's where it becomes an issue to have someone from the Indian government who works there, someone from the Saudis who just so happens to sneak in. Like, yeah, there are no ACLs and no one knows what anyone's looking at. So, you know, welcome to Twitter.
Right. Oh, and one of the other, speaking of like governments abusing Twitter, one of the other hilarious things was the when they were allowing Chinese Chinese companies to take out like ads on the Twitter network targeting the diaspora, and then collecting the mobile ID, which gets handed over as that, which you can then use with location databases from data brokers, and you can find out, you know, all of this other information, and then you can start figuring out like, okay, so we think that this person like is a dissident who is causing problems. Let's find out where they're located, what their name is, you know, their address, all that stuff. And Twitter is banned in China. Like, why would Chinese companies need to purchase ads? Because no one in China can see it. Like the odds of it being abused are far higher than it being legitimate. And then Mudge says that when he raised it as an issue, he was told that basically the revenue from China was too important to like cut it off because people might get, you know.
And that's the crux of this whole thing, right? The revenue the fine that they might get levied on them, probably less than the revenue generated in the last 72 hours since the announcement.
But I mean, I think that's also the funny part of this is Twitter is not a successful company, right? Like we're talking about this. In comparison to your Instagrams, your Facebooks, you know, your other social media, Twitter has been in this bizarre struggle to define itself, to monetize, to manage revenue. I think everyone can argue the importance of Twitter as a discussion platform, but not as a revenue generating machine of the scale of Instagram. And I think that's where you look at them and go, I can understand how Instagram doesn't need to plump its numbers of daily active users and subscribers and so on, but Twitter does. Like, I don't really think they've had them. Like, if Dave was here, he would say, oh, there's way less bots than there used to be. It's like, yeah, but there's way more bots than there should be, right? Like, there isn't a motivation to genuinely cap some of that off and admit that the real numbers are probably a fraction of what they say.
Well, I think they're facing the problem that like it's sort of they would have to take this one-term hit to sort of come clean and then, you know, fix it legitimately and deal with it as a thing going forward. And they don't want to do that because they probably cannot survive that hit. Like they're not, you know, they don't have super deep pockets. Like their stock is in the fucking garbage. Like it's not a
also, how big a hit? How big a hit, right? Like how many, if they're saying, look, I'm going to make this up completely, but if they're saying that there's 500 million daily active users just tweeting their fucking hearts out, and in reality, it's something like 5 million, right? Like you're talking about, and frankly, I wouldn't be super surprised because Twitter is a platform that requires a very specific kind of engagement, right? You're not necessarily just posting like a picture of your food, and then it's a very specific kind of engagement. I think the fact that they never figured out how to describe their metrics in other terms that are not the same as those of Instagram or whatnot, like amount of engagement. I don't know. There should be other ways that they could define this.
They should have a fucking paid tier. Like, if any of the people in charge of Twitter actually used Twitter, it would be a better experience. But like, it's so amazingly obvious that they don't. Like, they've got no idea how it works. It's just like it's a thing, and people show up, and like they should get ads because that's how everything works, as far as they're concerned. And like, that's it. There's like no understanding of like how Twitter works as a fucking like.
Well, we're on that topic, right? The new CEO is precisely the person who is on top of what is a largely failing and problematic tech stack. Like, I don't think that they haven't done editing because they have a strong moral obligation against editing. I think it's the same as the IDA Pro undo button, right? It's the hardest thing to do until a competitor comes around, and then you can do it in a month. I think in the case of Twitter, like if you look at their threading, I have a feeling their tech stack is just like teetering along, managing volume and sort of how things relate. And the idea of editing a tweet is just one step too fucking far for how they built this thing.
Yeah, like it's because they do like all the sharding stuff, so that when you tweet, it does like a fan out where it gets replicated to like all of these separate shards, so it could be like, eventually consistent where you are. And then the big problem is like fan in, when like everyone replies, and suddenly you've got like this huge influx, which they never dealt with. But yeah, like I think even the fact that they've got so many people with like so much access is a reflection of their bad tech stack. Like, they've never paid down all of the debt that they've accumulated, and I don't know if they can afford to. Like, it's like you look at Facebook and they're doing really well, but they're also got like huge amounts of money, and they're spending $1 million per engineer. Like, they can, if they don't have a good tech stack, it would be fucking embarrassing. Twitter, I think.
But I mean, look at that tech stack too. I mean, when it comes, there's something super impressive about. I mean, there's a lot of things that are super impressive about Facebook, but one of them being it is on the surface just another social media platform, the way that Twitter is a social media platform. But under the hood, like the engineering that's going into this thing is fucking insane, and they're building their own servers, and they're managing their own data centers, and they're like they have clearly gone the Google route of like, we're gonna build a planet of computing that powers this thing.
So
Twitter's not there.
The thing is, I'll note though, the building of servers may be for something slightly different as well. In this, by no means an expert on this, but by building their own servers and reducing dependence on external providers, theoretically, wouldn't that make it a asset for the company, which basically creates this sort of like consistent living value for them, where it's the like, even if all of our users leave tomorrow, we can at least, thank fucking God, sell the servers off.
Right. Dude, a part of that being
they
like,
also depreciate, which is a tax write-off. So
you amortize them over 5 years. Yeah. I think what you have to keep in mind there is the reason so much investment tends to go into the servers and the SLAs and whatnot is actually that if you want to have ad auctions and you want to do targeted ads, you need to be able to respond in microseconds to these requests, which is why Google has fucking killed it on building this sort of response and having this insane throughput. And it obviously helps them in a variety of other things. Similarly, Facebook, they have a shit ton of data. They have to figure out different kinds of database. And like, there's a complex problem there that much smarter people can speak to in ways that I can't. But then there's also the fact that like, you need to know how to serve these ads in split seconds to the right people and very specific demographics and pay the highest bidder and whatnot. Like, all that math is going into it. Whereas we get like a promoted tweet from a random like guy who just got his CISP, and like it goes to everyone in InfoSec, and you're like, holy shit, well, like your tech is just amazing, guys. Like, block, right? That's the extent of like Twitter's add capability.
Like that reminds me of like a thing that Charles Strauss said, which was if you look at like the space race in the US, what you really have is we can put anything that's approximately the size and shape of a nuclear warhead into space. So if you can fit a person inside that, we're good to go. Right? Like that was pretty much what was happening for most of the space race. It was like, you know, something that weighs a few tons, you know, it takes up this much volume, it doesn't exceed these parameters. Like we
Does
can
the
shove that
person
into
need
space
to be
and allow-
encased in lead? Like what's the trigger like for people?
Yeah.
Well, so okay, Silas pointed out that there was a question. Prime Gaming was talking about sort of a spy from Saudi Arabia. Okay, yes, yeah. We already went through this with Twitter. Like, it's not like the India thing is the beginning of the possibility that a government might want someone in there.
If there was one person and there were two people, they probably got both of them. I mean, what are the odds that there's three? You know, like once is coincidence, and that's what we've got. Is it's a coincidence that two people who worked for the government also worked at Twitter. I wouldn't worry about it. This doesn't seem like a plausible threat scenario.
Look, I would assume that there are government whatevers in every major tech company in one way or another. They should be struggling to get information. That's the whole point of like all this zero trust nonsense, right? Like most of it is lip service. But if you build something that's genuinely zero trust, you have the ACLs, you have whatever, minimum required privileges, etc. They should be there struggling to try to find a way to get the info that they wish they had access to. And what we're hearing from Twitter is there's no struggle at all, guys. Like, come on in. You'll have access to whatever the fuck you want.
That speaks to the
find out someone had access. Sorry.
Yeah, it speaks to the probably inadvertent counterintelligence capabilities of these companies where, you know, the easiest way is to walk up and go, hey, how many, where does the decimal point on this check have to be for you to let my people in there? And if the answer is none, like, okay, fine. I've got a cadre of people. This is a SRE, this is a developer, this is a HR person, they're gonna apply and they're gonna you're not gonna know. They're just gonna they just happen to, there's an ethnic tie or whatever, cultural tie, and you're not gonna know, right? But every once in a while you come across, like you say, a company like Twitter, they're like, yes, oh, this much, and here you go.
Yeah. Yeah,
it could be a struggle. I think that's the most you can do. Like, look, when we talk about social media companies, that's a really fancy way of saying we've built a company on toxic PII. And it revolves around toxic PII. It gains its value from toxic PII. It's meant to collect toxic PII, store it, and resurface it. So, like, the one thing you have to worry about internally is ACLs and protecting this information. Like, I hate GDPR. I'm not one of these like sort of privacy rah-rah folks, but as far as company management goes and systems management goes, there should be an alert when someone goes snooping through Donald Trump's DMs, right? Like the chances that you have a legitimate reason to have done that are much lower than, someone in support was sort of figuring out where the boundaries are of what they can look at.
Like this is the sort of thing where you kind of want that nuclear thing of like two people have to turn a key at the same time, because when it has to happen, you can't just have like one person taking responsibility.
By the way, if you know a vendor for those, for the multi-device key things or anything that resembles things from GoldenEye, please let me know. That is a high need item. But I also want to point out as well that even if it is something where you could approach them and say, where do I put the decimal for the check for you? That service is not being taxed adequately. And that is also something they should be investigating as well. Because if you are providing essentially a service of
Twitter is leaving money on the table. Why are they not profitable? It's because they are not billing
Uncle Sam
intelligence agents to work at their fucking company. This is...
I'm sorry, did Saudi Arabia get this for free? I mean, you're not bleeding the Saudis for something they want? Like, what kind of tech company are you?
They should hire someone from NSO I think that's like once
What's
Edison
next?
is down,
You're gonna
there's
do
an
pro bono
opportunity
work for the
guys to go
UAE?
on Twitter
Like,
and
what is this? Now,
Yeah.
look, okay, getting back to some of the more serious part of this, Mudge has bitten off a fairly big problematic sort of situation, and I wish him all the best, right? Like I hope this goes well for him. I don't think we understand the impetus yet, right? Like the why and the now of it, I'm sure is still sort of murky in some ways, and I'm hoping we'll come to understand that because Mudge is a really smart guy, and he has plenty of other cool shit to do. So there must have been a pretty good fucking reason for him to go through this nightmare that is trying to blow the whistle on a big tech company.
People do not choose to do whistleblowing
For fun.
unless they have no other options, really. Like it's never a pleasant experience. So I can't imagine that he was just like, fuck it, I'm not doing anything on Friday. Got a couple hours to kill. Why don't I?
Right. Like I'm taking a break between jobs, and now would be a great time to whistleblow, right?
Though I will say, of the people that can pull this and come out of it unscathed, Mudge would be one of the people I would put in my betting pool on it. Is that he's got the history, he's built the cred, and yeah.
But I think a part of that, and I hate to make this like a call to action type situation, is there is an aspect of the threat and of the InfoSec community that does have to, in a way, rally around what's happening here. Because look, you get Errata Rob and this Amoroso guy, and like all these sort of outliers of InfoSec who are either living their best edgelord life or they're living off of this like CISO support group bullshit where you just always have a hot take, you tell people what to think, it doesn't matter that you might not know what the fuck you're talking about in any given situation, and you kind of keep going. But like I think this is an important one. Like if we keep telling hackers and InfoSec folks to go take these roles and be a part of these big companies and try to do the right thing and try to influence change, and one of our best goes out there, finds a completely like unmovable, fucked up situation and decides to do the right thing, we can't leave them out to pasture, right? Like this is, I think, a defining moment on whether we actually stand by these missions or not.
I think that's absolutely true. And part of that as well is like, we always talk a big thing about like how important security is. And this is kind of an opportunity to see like, is it actually that important? Or do you just like saying that because it makes your job sound cool? Because if security is actually important and it ends up, here's the thing where security was a requirement and they were not meeting that requirement, do we actually care about that? Or is it just like, well, it's important, so they should have spent more money on kit like my company
part like not the bar, right? Like I do think we have to highlight that, right? Like I think the most relatable situation is you look at something like Facebook at the time when Cambridge Analytica was happening, yes, there's a security issue in the middle of what's going on, but there's something way bigger happening that you're misreporting. Or like, again, Facebook with like the genocides that it has happened to enable in certain places that we just so happen to forget about, right? Yes, there is a trust and safety issue. There's a security element to it, but there's a slightly bigger problem here that might have to do with, human lives and other things. Those are the moments we're talking about. And I think that's what the CISO crowd, the Ed Amorosos, are missing. It's like nobody's sitting here going, man, they didn't patch these servers fast enough, so fuck you, I'm going to the SEC. Like there are way bigger problems that have spawned off of this. And there's a sort of complicit element in saying, oh, the bots aren't there, or like X, Y, and Z isn't happening. And I think that's where we're asking folks to actually step up. Like I've been in companies, or at least a company, where I considered the whole thing to be kind of a fraud shit show, and I, walked out as quickly as I could. What parts of that has actual effect, right? Like what parts of that genuinely matters? And you go, okay, A, maybe you're defrauding your customers. B, does it have any kind of like bigger impact beyond that? Well, there's elements of it that you worry about, and they have more to do with the external impact that your company has beyond like, look, if you run a bullshit little like startup somewhere and it might as well be like an IOC Hadron Collider, but no one's using it. Who cares, right? Like, fine, like your tech sucks, but no one's going to have no one needs to have a public square conversation about that. It's these bigger services where there are, waterfall problems.
You bring up a good point about the size or the nature of the entity, and the clash or the symbiosis with the security executive communities, right, or cultures. So if you work for a major corporation, the major tech corp, if you're the CISO or top security guy of the original high tech company, right, you're a part of the corporate machine and the cog, and you're working in conjunction with folks, and it's not necessarily a prevent the breach thing. It's a build up resources and capabilities sort of thing. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the people who are there. Their sole purpose is window dressing, and as soon as something goes south, they're the scapegoat, right? So, and then there's a scale of things in between that people have to deal with, and I would not be surprised if there are any number of people who are like, look, I've been doing this for 20 years in 2-year sprints, right, and 10 companies, right. So this is I'm going to behave this way. I know how this is played. I know what the organization I work for, how they think, how they, what they want. Here's the boundaries that I can operate in. And I'm not going to, I could stick my neck out, but I'm not much. I'm Steve Smith, right? And I can't draw on my fame and notoriety to keep me going. I've chosen this path, and I've got to walk down it for a few more years. So these are the things. This is how I operate. And do I feel kind of bad inside? Yeah, okay, but you know what? My kids eat, so to coin a phrase.
How special is that, Mike? Like, how unusual is that versus the fucking definition of what a CISO at a major company is supposed to be? Because like I've made this joke in a lot of different ways, but like it really does feel like a lot of the CISO roles we hear about in mega corporations are about like, this is the person we fire when the data breach gets too big, like when we just can't, sort of hide it under the rug. And I hate to put it that way because it's a shit job for those people as well, but like that does seem to be in large part the role. You are the person we're going to fire. In the meantime, you're going to be very well paid. You get 2 years, and it also isn't going to stain your career. You can go on to do this at a sister company after this, no problem, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, and there are some pretty notable folks along that route, and they make it pretty far in that way. But you don't then get to come and say that like you are somehow the arbiter of correctness in that situation. Like you're almost in a situation where you're not supposed, like you're just meant to kind of look sideways and look aside at what's going on.
Yeah. And what do you do for a living, right? So Twitter, Facebook, is that pseudo critical infrastructure in an information age society? I would say that's absolutely correct, right? But if you make widgets, literally make widgets, right? And so what if your security is shit, right? It doesn't make any a big difference there. The cultural aspect of that is not as important, right? You expect, if the guy who runs the water plant is responsible for security of the water plant, doesn't do his job properly, people die, that guy should be strung up, right? There's that is a gig where you cannot slack off. The expectations are very high, right? So, the fact that it's like, oh, we're just a social media company. And it's like, no, they like people stormed the Capitol because of shit that went off
on Twitter.
Profile, right? On Twitter. You should be taking serious. And the fact that we don't have that conversation, nobody wants to force that on them. And to recognize that is a big part of the problem.
Yeah, so I think that kind of hits on it, is that it's like there's the ethical requirements of like, will this person fall on their sword and do the right thing? Kind of depends on what the company is doing. And the thing is, like, social media companies are actually far more important now than, a random factory or, whatever, making widgets, for example. And so I have a lot more leeway for someone who's in a similar situation at a widget manufacturer and decides, you know what, fuck it, like I can live with this. Like they're doing the wrong thing, they're violating some whatever stuff, but at the end of the day, it's widgets. It doesn't matter.
But you can
I
make
can
the
kind of
argument that the widget company is in process, right? Like, and I think that that's something you have to allow. The widget company sucks at security and they move very slow, but they understand. We've told them what they need to do. It's not a major investment right now because widgets are in a tough situation from profitability standpoint. But little by little, we are incrementally getting to the point. And like the chances that the security of the widget company matters, not a big deal. Like all security is a process. We get it. We understand that. What we're talking about is where it goes in conjunction with the actual function and splash of what the company can do. And I would argue at this point, how much of what the impact of what Mudge is saying, how much does it have to do with security at all?
So I think there's a couple of things going on. One of them is, just violating the law. They were required to have certain security requirements. They reported that they were meeting those requirements, and Mudge shows that here are multiple ways in which they have demonstrably failed to actually be meeting those requirements and also lied about it. So that's, like the breaking the law aspect. But the other thing is, of course, like, allowing the Chinese companies to hunt for dissidents and, letting the Indian government agents come and work there and not doing anything to protect the actually important information. Like, it doesn't really matter if everyone can see the email that you use to sign up. Like everyone at Twitter has access to your initial like sign up phone number or whatever is bad, but access to your DMs is much worse. And it seems like they haven't sort of accepted their responsibility there. Like, we know that years and years and years ago, they were going to implement encrypted DMs, and they got a prototype done. And then the guy that was championing it and whatever left the company because it was never going to happen. Like they could do it, but they won't for whatever reason. And they're not taking the responsibility of owning that data seriously, and that's
and
it
the thing
shows
is,
up as security, but that's what it's actually about. So
we keep seeing these initiatives, and the thing is every social network platform has had one of these discussions. It feels like even Facebook at one point there was like private messages will always be encrypted. But the simple truth of the matter is the minute that they find out about that, or the ads team finds out about those things, they're like, fuck that. Like we can profit on that data in order to serve you more targeted ads. And the thing is like,
sorry, improve your experience by giving
you personalized ads.
That's fair. I've really been enjoying a lot of the ads I've been getting recently. But yeah, it shows also that it continues to go back to this thing of if you're not paying for it, you are the product. But the other thing as well is that doesn't natively fit though into the society and the world that we actually are supposed to be living in with this, because if you're calling something critical infrastructure and it is the means of acquiring information and getting updates like, hey, the power is out, it's going to be an hour, but in order to receive those basic status updates as living part of a community and things, it also means that you need to subject like all of your personal information to foreign governments and others. It's an incredibly broken system.
There's two parts to that I would love to highlight in what Silas is saying. First of all, I know of one company that actually went through with the whole end-to-end encrypted thing, like genuinely pulled it off and did it well, and that's Snapchat. And if they did it, I think they had a very real motivation to, which is our servers are packed full of amateur pornography. Some of it might be 16-year-olds. We don't want to have shit to do with whatever's inside of these messages. End-to-end encrypt that shit as quickly as possible. Right. And they pulled it off.
And like Google Cloud. So Google Cloud has got gigs and gigs of child porn, all of Snapchat, which is ironic.
Okay, so I was like, where is this going?
Which is ironic given one of the other stories that happened this week, which The link that I see with the story of the guy who took pictures of like his child's genitals to send to his pediatrician, and then Google flagged it as CSAM, or like child sex abuse material. The police investigated him and cleared him because it was, legitimately not child sex abuse material. But Google never gave him his stuff back, and all they will say about it is, like, we take this very, very seriously. And I think that is like the failure that Google has there, which is the failure to have like anything other than a bureaucratic response. Like they can't deal with individual issues and correcting their problems. It's part of the problem that Twitter has, right? Like they ban people randomly for, swearing at Nazis. And like the Nazis will mass report this person, and then Twitter will be like, we're getting a lot of reports about this guy. He's obviously being rude to one of our users. Let's give them a timeout.
It goes to show that there isn't a real trust and safety program, right? Like you don't have a Sam Davidson running your TNS program who like is genuinely trying to account for these edge cases, the failures, like where things go wrong, like how your actual abuse reporting can become a tool for abuse. Like it's like managing an economy in an MMORPG. It's a constant balance, and you need to have a conversation about it and sort of keep things fun for everybody. But like that's not what's happening here. They're not genuinely engaging. And I mean, on that front, I know that we're pretty close to
like do the bare minimum, which is they want to do just enough not to get smacked for it. That's it.
Did you see the story? Like there was a story about these OnlyFans models who were sleeping with, like, anytime their account got banned from Instagram, they would go sleep with a few nerds over in the valley until somebody would like reactivate their Instagram accounts. Like,
yeah.
There's aspects of TNS here that, like, again,
who among us?
That's the only way I keep my Twitter account. Every time I executives, I have to go do some favors. But no, I mean, there's aspects of TNS that clearly are horrendously broken, and they go all the way from the simple, like, well, I don't know how to handle it when my mom's account gets locked out, all the way to, how do we handle someone like Donald Trump's sort of bizarre edge case situation? And even it even does actually fall into threat intel stuff, like the justification for not giving us detailed nation state targeting your account banners is in part, well, we don't know if we're giving it to the right person. We don't know if the information's getting to the attacker versus the actual victim. And then obviously what can they do with that information, even if they had it, right? Like, but a lot of this comes back down to this sort of like identity problem. And I'm not pimping any solution other than to say it obviously doesn't work well to just have a fucking form and like email abuse at, right? Like that doesn't work.
Oh, and the fucking options that they have never match what actually happened. It's like, this email is impersonating someone, or like, yeah, like this message is impersonating someone. It's like, no, this is promoting like fucking the Holocaust. Like,
this gaggle of Nazis has decided that they don't like my commentary. Is never a button on there, right?
Oh, like this is flat out just spam from a fucking coin that's supposed to be sold, like some crypto bullshit. Like that's not an option. It's like, this is harmful to the community, like motherfuckers. Which, it's time actually. So I'm gonna open it up for any last comments, because somehow we managed to talk exclusively about Mudge, how Twitter sucks. So none of us actually use Twitter, of course. It's
fuck that thing. Who has time? We have real jobs and stuff.
Yeah, cool. So thanks guys for joining us today, and it has been great. And I think that we've actually illuminated some of the aspects that have been missing in the public discourse about Mudge's whistleblowing. And I sort of hope that going forward, the conversation improves and looks less at, would I have done this in his place, and more about like, what is Twitter doing wrong? And, this isn't about nitpicking specific security things and so on. Anyway, so thanks, Jags,
Thanks,
Tanji,
everybody.
Silas.
Grug. We'll see you guys in a week, I guess.
Oh, wait, I've got this. Don't forget to OCO that subscribe button, network effects, those comments, and CNA that bell.
You're fired. Bye, guys.